Hey, what's happening, A-Push kids? We're here for our next lecture in AP US History. Today we're going to be doing topic 3.7, and we're going to be covering the Articles of Confederation. Our learning objective today is learning objective 3H. Explain how different forms of government developed and changed as a result of the Revolutionary period. In particular, today we're going to be looking at America's first government, and it's not the one that we have now, so that hopefully should give you a sense for how successful it was. Our first key idea today is, number one, many new state constitutions placed power in the hands of the legislative branch and made property qualifications for voting and for citizenship. So, essentially, what we want to know here is that when Americans declared independence in 1776, we needed a new form of government. And what we wanted was we wanted a form of a government that was a republic, where citizens voted for elected leaders to represent them. What we really wanted to get away from was we wanted to get away from the type of government under King George III, where we had this tyrannical monarch that had all of the power and all of the control. And we especially wanted to try and protect citizens and the individual states from a very powerful national government. And we wanted to base a lot of this on the enlightened version of the Roman Senate. Now, when we first declared independence, we were independent states. Each colony was its own independent country, essentially. Many of them wrote their own state constitutions, and they gave the legislators all the power in those particular institutions. And voting qualifications was very similar to what had happened before the American Revolution. To vote, you had to own property, be 21, and be a male. Now, we should remember that the ability to own land wasn't exactly a gigantic hurdle for most people to overcome. Land in the colonies was plentiful and cheap. So if you weren't able to own land at this point, at least how the early founders figured, was that you probably had done something wrong in terms of your finances. You were somehow incapable of maintaining even basic finances. That's why you couldn't own land. And so if you couldn't even do the real basics, then you probably don't need to be voting. At least that's kind of how they thought of things. However, the 13 independent states really needed some sort of national framework. For instance, they needed to be able to sign treaties, and right after we declare independence, we're of course looking right at France to try and get that treaty signed. And we also needed to be able to form and fund a military, especially to be able to fight against England during the American Revolution. To do this, we create our first government, and that's called the Articles of Confederation. It lasts from 1777 to 1789. And that brings us to key idea number 2, which states, the Articles of Confederation unified the newly independent states, creating a central government with limited power. Now, this new confederation-style government loosely connected the states under a very weak national government. The idea of this confederation was that it was going to be really more of a league of friendship rather than a strong united nation. We didn't want that strong central government. We had just left a strong central government, and we wanted to be really kind of the opposite of that. Really more what it was is 13 separate governments that were slightly connected to each other by this confederation government, which met first in Philadelphia and then eventually in New York City after the Revolution was over. Now, in this government, each state could send anywhere between 2 to 7 representatives to the National Congress. However, it didn't matter how many you sent, each state only had 1 vote. So within each state's delegation, that group of people that represented the state, if there was any disagreement within the delegation, they would have to have their own little private vote to decide which way their state would vote. 1 vote per state. And things got a little bit more complicated from there. To pass any law on a national level, 9 of the 13 states had to agree. And that's a pretty high bar today. Now, we today have a fairly divided Congress, and it's difficult at the national level sometimes for a national government to decide and get things done. But even when they do come to an agreement, most laws that are passed by our national government, even to this day, are usually only passed with small majorities, maybe 52, 55% of delegates agreeing to a particular law, and many people disagree. 9 out of 13, a supermajority, nearly 70% of people having to agree, made it very difficult for them to pass any laws. Now, the National Congress could make laws. It could settle disputes between states. It could negotiate treaties with foreign nations. It could handle Indian affairs. It could oversee a military and a navy. The problem is, that's the entire list. They couldn't do anything else. All other powers were left to the states. Now, once again, the entire reason behind this is we didn't want to recreate the powerful government like we were trying to break away from during the American Revolution. There's no president because that looks way too much like a king. And the national government couldn't tax states or individual citizens. You may remember from the Revolution, one of the biggest rallying cries was no taxation without representation. Once again, here's just another way to look at the list. This is really all they could do. Enforce national government policy, control state militia. This is all the stuff that the states can do. They can veto amendments to the Articles of Confederation. It was very, very difficult to get anything done. John Dickinson, writing to the records of the federal government in 1787, said, "Let our government be like that of the solar system. Let the general government be like the sun and the states the planets, repelled yet attracted, and the whole moving regularly and harmoniously in their several orbits." Leading us to key point number 3. Now, this is probably one of the things that the national government did get right, dealing with the settlement of Western lands. Now, settlers continued to move west during the 1780s, and Congress enacted a law called the Northwest Ordinance for admitting new states. The ordinance promoted public education, the protection of private property, and a ban on slavery in the Northwest Territory. Now, the western lands that are being thought of here are these lands that are over in this region right over here. This is the area that is called the Northwest Territory because it is in the northwest portion of the United States at that particular time. The first hurdle that the national government, though, had to get over was western land claims. Each of the different states had claimed different lands all the way to the Mississippi River. And those lands between the Appalachians and the Mississippi, acquired from the British in the Treaty of Paris of 1783, had been claimed by numerous states, and a lot of these claims overlapped one another. And so in 1783, the Articles of Confederation established a good system of settling western lands. The first thing that happened was that these western land claims were ceded by the states, and they were given to the national government. Then, so this here became the Northwest Territory after the states had ceded the land to the national government. Then, Congress is going to pass the Land Ordinance of 1785. What this does is this creates an orderly way to divide the West into townships and farms. Selling western land was the only way that the national government can generate money, since it did not have the power to tax. Now, this Land Ordinance of 1785 is really significant for how the West starts to become settled. In the West, areas were divided up into townships, 6 miles by 6 miles each. And within that, they were divided into 1 by 1 mile squares, which were further subdivided into areas to be able to sell off. Now, within each of those larger squares, Section 16, the money from that particular land sale, was set aside for public education. and the money from that land sale was put directly into building schools in that particular area. 2 years later, the government will pass a law called the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, and this gave government to the territories. The first thing that had to happen for a territory to start to set up their own government was 5,000 residents had to be there, and they could create a self-governing legislature. Then, when 60,000 residents had arrived in the territory, they could apply to become a U.S. state. However, and probably most significantly, in this entire region, slavery was outlawed, thus creating a significant divide between northern free states and southern slave states. Bringing us to key idea number 4. After the Revolution, difficulties over international trade, finances, interstate commerce, foreign relations, and internal unrest led to calls for a stronger state government. Now, as we've mentioned before, the inability of the government to collect taxes led to many problems. For instance, the trade deficit and the national debt continued to grow. Americans could not pay off their debts from the Revolutionary War, and many state governments had to raise taxes to pay their particular debts. In particular, property foreclosures became very common, and in Massachusetts, many farmers, several of them, were being foreclosed upon by banks in Boston, and these people had fought during the American Revolution, rebelled when taxes were increased and foreclosures increased as well. Led by a man named Daniel Shays, they led what was called Shays Rebellion in 1787, and the government could not pay for an army to stop it. Daniel Shays Rebellion, and once again, caused as by debt courts, start to threaten the federal arsenal. Even though it was a small rebellion, only about 2,000 farmers in western Massachusetts, Shays Rebellion proves to be the convincing event that leads to the Constitutional Convention in 1787. It is because of Shays Rebellion that people realize that the Articles of Confederation are too weak, and we need a government that is stronger. So once again, in review, the Articles of Confederation, our League of Friendship, was something that was incredibly weak. Congress couldn't tax the #1 issue. It was difficult to change. There was no executive branch and no national court system. And people realized, as in people especially like Hamilton and Madison, knew we needed a stronger central government. Those people met together in the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia to discuss new ways to improve those Articles of Confederation. However, they soon realized that the Articles really couldn't be saved, and instead of revising them, the delegates would eventually replace that with a new constitution. Now, how that new constitution is created and the parts that go into it are the subject of our next lecture. Until next time, go Pack!